Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Randolph County, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard the story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1867 in Harper's Mill, West Virginia, was particularly unforgiving. Frost clung to the window panes of the valley homes like skeletal fingers, and the wind howled through the bare oak trees with an almost human-like lamentation. The Civil War had ended just 2 years prior, leaving scars, both visible and invisible, across the landscape. But for those living in the aging Georgian mansion at the end of Oak Ridge Road, the silence came from something deeper than post-war melancholy. The property belonged to Martha Collins, a widow of 64, descended from one of the original founding families of the region. The house stood apart from the modest dwellings nearby, with its imposing facade featuring 4 white columns, tall windows protected by intricate iron grills, and a rear garden that neighbors said had once been magnificent. Now, however, weeds overtook the abandoned flower beds, and ivy climbed the peeling walls, creating shadows that seemed to shift as twilight descended. Municipal records from that period describe the residence as having been built in 1803 by Jeremiah Collins, Martha's father-in-law, during the prosperous years of early settlement. The architecture blended elements from Jeremiah's European travels with adaptations to the harsh mountain winters. According to documents from the time, the house occupied approximately 1 acre of land and featured 2 main floors plus an attic and an extensive cellar that curiously spanned only half the total area of the construction. It was common for passers-by to quicken their pace when walking past the residence, especially after sunset. There was no specific reason for this behavior, at least not one that could be clearly articulated. It was more of a sensation, a subtle discomfort, as if the house observed those who passed by. Interviews conducted by historian Augustus Harrington in 1952 with former residents of the area reveal that even before Martha Collins's disappearance, the house already possessed a peculiar reputation. Cordelia Stump, a laundress who worked for several affluent families on the road, reported, "That house was always different. Even when Mr. Zachariah Collins was still alive, there was something strange there. The clothes I washed for them always had a smell. Not common dirt, but something like damp earth and dried herbs, even the clean pieces. And Mrs. Collins always handed me the clothes personally, never allowing me beyond the service entrance." The official story, the one recorded in municipal registers, was simple. Martha Collins lived alone after the death of her husband, Zachariah Collins, which occurred in 1859. Without heirs, she devoted herself to managing the assets left by her spouse and was rarely seen in town. Her public appearances were limited to Sunday services at the Methodist Church, always dressed in black, always seated in the same pew, always alone. The details of Zachariah Collins's death, though seemingly well documented, present intriguing inconsistencies. According to the official death certificate signed by Dr. Montgomery Pierce on January 12, 1859, the cause of death was recorded as cardiac arrest resulting from mountain fever. However, a more detailed medical report found in the archives of the old Harper's Mill Infirmary describes symptoms that hardly correspond to a simple fever. The patient exhibits periods of extreme agitation alternating with profound lethargy. He reports disturbing visions and insists that there is something inside the walls, watching him. The pupils remain dilated even under strong light, and the skin exhibits an abnormal pallor. More disturbing is the fact that, during episodes of delirium, he occasionally speaks in a language unknown to this physician. On February 14, 1867, Martha Collins did not attend church service. Initially, no one gave much importance to the fact. Elderly people occasionally fall ill or simply decide to stay home. But when her absence extended to 3 consecutive Sundays, Reverend Samuel Whitcomb decided to send his housekeeper, Millicent Davis, to check on the widow's well-being. Reverend Whitcomb was not a man who easily interfered in the affairs of his parishioners, especially those belonging to the traditional families of the town. According to his personal diaries, kept in the diocesan library, he harbored a peculiar respect for Martha Collins, mixed with something that could be described as apprehension. In an entry dated February 1866, he writes, "I heard Mrs. Collins' confession today. As always, her confessions are formal and contained, almost rehearsed. However, today I noticed something different in her eyes, a feverish gleam that does not match her usual composure. When I asked about her health, she only replied that the nights have been long. At the end, she asked me something unusual. She wanted to know if I believed the dead could return not by divine work, but by the force of an earthly promise. I answered with Scripture, naturally, but the question troubled me for the rest of the day." What Millicent found, or more precisely, what she did not find, would initiate a series of events that would profoundly mark the memory of the town, even though, as the years passed, many preferred to forget. According to the police report of March 4, 1867, filed at the Harper's Mill Sheriff's Office and subsequently transferred to the State Historical Archive, Millicent knocked at the door of the house at the end of Oak Ridge Road for long minutes without receiving a response. Noticing that the door was not locked, merely ajar, the housekeeper decided to enter, calling Martha's name. The interior of the house was impeccably clean and organized, as if it had been prepared to receive visitors. In the living room, on a side table, there was a half-empty teacup, already cold. No signs of struggle or disorder, no signs of Martha Collins. The police report, written by Clerk Percival Morris under the dictation of Sheriff Clayton Montgomery, describes the scene with almost clinical objectivity, but includes a curious detail. The housekeeper reports that, upon entering the residence, she noticed that all the clocks in the house were stopped exactly at 3:17, including the wall clock in the parlor, the pocket watch on the desk in the study, and even the small clock in the main bedroom. Mrs. Davis states that this detail caused her particular discomfort, although she could not explain why. Millicent toured all the rooms of the house, parlor, kitchen, 4 bedrooms, study, without finding the owner. As she later reported to the police, it was in the cellar that she noticed something unusual. An old dark wood chest, the kind used to store clothing or keepsakes, was open. Something uncommon considering that Martha Collins was known for keeping all her belongings carefully stored and locked. The cellar of the residence deserves a more detailed description, as its unusual configuration would later become an object of interest to investigators of the case. Unlike the typical cellars of colonial houses of the time, generally simple storage spaces with packed dirt floors, the cellar of the Collins house had been built with evident attention to detail. The floor was hewn stone, the walls coated with a type of mortar that, according to experts consulted years later, contained unusual components that made it exceptionally resistant to moisture. Illumination was provided by small barred windows at ground level, positioned in such a way that, even on cloudy days, the environment received sufficient light. The most curious aspect, however, was the division of the space. Although the house occupied a considerable area, the accessible cellar corresponded to only about half of this area. The other half, according to architectural plans of the time, would simply be compacted earth. However, the wall that separated the 2 sections was not aligned with any upper wall of the house, creating an asymmetrical layout that intrigued architects who later studied the case. Even more intriguing was the small dark wooden door, almost imperceptible, installed in the dividing wall, always kept locked by Martha Collins. Inside the chest, Millicent found only a black-covered notebook, apparently a ledger. Leafing through it quickly, she noticed that the pages were filled with elegant and precise handwriting, undoubtedly Martha's. However, something caught her attention. In the last written pages, the handwriting progressively became more tremulous, almost illegible, as if it had been recorded by someone under extreme stress or fear. The housekeeper took the ledger with her and went immediately to the sheriff's office, where she reported the widow's disappearance to Sheriff Clayton Montgomery. Sheriff Montgomery was not known for his investigative zeal. At 52, he held the position more due to his political connections than professional competence. A former military man of intermediate rank, he had been appointed sheriff in 1862 after supporting the winning faction in a local electoral dispute. His record of solved cases was mediocre, especially when they involved influential families in the region. A journalist of the time, Frederick Barrow, described him in a column as a man who prefers the comfort of his armchair to the discomfort of truth. The official investigation into Martha Collins's disappearance was superficial and brief. After 3 days of searching the property and surroundings, without finding any trace of the elderly woman, Sheriff Montgomery concluded that she had probably traveled to visit relatives in Richmond without telling anyone. The case was filed, and the house on Oak Ridge Road was closed, awaiting the owner's return. The investigation reports, although succinct, mention a detail that did not receive due attention at the time. During the inspection of the property, the officers found all of Martha Collins's clothes and personal belongings intact in the wardrobes. Her jewelry box contained all the pieces cataloged in her personal inventory, including valuable items such as a pearl necklace and a pair of sapphire earrings that, according to witnesses, she greatly valued, as they had been gifts from her late husband. In the drawer of her desk, a wallet containing a considerable amount of money remained untouched. If the widow had really traveled of her own volition, she had left without taking any belongings or resources. However, the ledger found by Millicent was never attached to the official process. Sheriff Montgomery claimed to have returned it to the Reverend's housekeeper, who in turn claimed never to have received it back. For decades, the whereabouts of this document remained unknown until in 1953, during the renovation of an old parish house in Harper's Mill, a mason named Bartholomew Jenkins found a wooden box embedded in a false wall. Inside the box, wrapped in black silk fabric, was Martha Collins's ledger. The discovery was initially kept secret by the mason, who, superstitious, feared that the object might be related to some unorthodox religious practice. It was only 3 months later, upon overhearing a casual conversation about the old mystery of the vanished widow, that Bartholomew decided to reveal his discovery to his employer, engineer Nathaniel Webster, who in turn informed the ecclesiastical authorities. Father Zechariah Bowman, responsible for the parish at that time, took possession of the document and, after reading its contents, decided to hand it over to the History Department of the University of West Virginia. However, for reasons never officially clarified, the ledger was filed in the Restricted Documents section of the University Library, where it remained inaccessible to the public for another 5 years. Father Bowman, a cultured and methodical man, educated in theology at Princeton University, was not given to superstitions or unnecessary alarms. This makes even more intriguing the content of a letter he sent to the Bishop of Charleston, along with his request to transfer the ledger to the university. In the letter, partially preserved in diocesan archives, he writes, "Your Excellency will understand my hesitation in deciding the appropriate fate for this document. Its content, especially in the final pages, raises questions that transcend the scope of our common theological understanding. I am not suggesting anything of a supernatural nature. I am, as you know, averse to such explanations. But there is in these pages a testimony of something profoundly disturbing that I believe should be studied by minds prepared for deeper psychological and historical analyses. What concerns me is not so much what is written, but the evident transformation in the person who wrote it. In 1958, Professor Harrison Blackburn, during research on the social history of West Virginia in the early 19th century, obtained authorization to consult the document. What he found in the yellowed pages of Martha Collins' ledger disturbed him deeply, leading him to abandon his original research and dedicate himself exclusively to the study of that case. Harrison Blackburn was not merely a competent historian, but also a meticulous researcher with secondary training in psychology. Born in 1911 in Charleston, he had served briefly in the Army during World War II before dedicating himself to academic life. His specialty was the documentation of oral histories and the analysis of personal documents, such as letters and diaries, to reconstruct social and psychological aspects of historical periods. When he gained access to Martha Collins' ledger, he was working on an extensive study of social transformations in Appalachia at the turn of the century. The first entries in the ledger dated from January 1859, soon after Zachariah Collins's death. They were mundane notes about the day-to-day life of a widow, lists of chores, expense records, occasionally reflections on solitude and loss. The handwriting was firm, organized, reflecting the methodical personality that acquaintances attributed to Martha Collins. An entry from March 1839 offers a glimpse of the widow's routine and mental state at that time. March 17, 1859. Today I received a visit from Mr. Wainwright, solicitor, to deal with pending matters of the inventory. The papers are in order, as Zachariah always kept them. The house, the lands in Pickens County, and the shares in the mining company remain as solid assets, sufficient to maintain me comfortably for the rest of my days. I feel grateful for this, but would trade all this material security for a few more years by his side. The nights are especially difficult. The house seems larger and emptier. Sometimes I wake up thinking I have heard his voice calling me from the study, as he did when working late. The doctor recommended that I take valerian drops to help with sleep, but I hesitate. I prefer the lucidity of pain to the confusion induced by medicines. Over the following months, the entries follow a similar pattern, documenting Martha's gradual adaptation to her new reality as a widow. She mentions occasional visits from acquaintances, decisions about the administration of her assets, and reflections on mourning. A recurring theme is her reluctance to modify any aspect of the house or dispose of her husband's belongings, as if preserving the physical environment could, somehow, keep his presence alive. A curious entry from August 1859 mentions the cellar of the house for the first time. August 22nd. 1859. I needed to go down to the cellar today to fetch some wine bottles for dinner with Judge Wainwright. I had not entered there since Zachariah's death. He always insisted on being the only one to handle that particular wine collection. Strangely, I found the small door at the back ajar, although I am certain it should be locked. The key, which Zachariah always carried with him, was in the lock. I did not dare to look at what lies beyond it. I never entered that compartment. Zachariah said it was merely a storage for old family objects, things of no value, but which he did not have the courage to discard. I closed the door, removed the key, and now keep it with me. Tomorrow I will ask Absalom to check if there is some external entrance that might explain how that door came open. However, from November 1866, the tone of the entries began to change subtly. Martha started to record strange sensations, nocturnal noises that she could not identify, a persistent feeling of being watched, objects that seemed to change places when she was not looking. November 16, 1866, again that sound, like nails scratching wood coming from the walls. I asked Absalom to check for possible rats, but he found no trace. Perhaps it is just the old house settling, as he suggested. But why always at midnight? Absalom Decker was the gardener and handyman who worked for Martha 3 times a week. According to municipal employment records, he left service at the house on Oak Ridge Road in December 1866, claiming to have found a better position at a farm on the outskirts of town. However, when Professor Blackburn managed to locate a relative of Absalom, Josephine Decker, in 1958, she told a different story. Absalom never talked about that house, nor about the old lady. When we asked why he had left a stable job in town to work so far away, he just said that there were things that money couldn't compensate. On the night before leaving for the farm, I heard him tell his wife that the walls of that house had eyes and ears. We never understood what he meant by that. Josephine also revealed to Professor Blackburn a disturbing detail that does not appear in any official record. Her father, a previously healthy and robust man, began to waste away soon after leaving employment at Martha Collins' house. It was as if something consumed him from within, she described. He lost weight, lost his appetite, and at night suffered from nightmares so intense that he would scream until he was hoarse. Before dying just 6 months after leaving that house, he was delirious about something that lived between the walls, and repeated, "I shouldn't have looked, shouldn't have opened that door." The entries in the ledger became more disturbing as December progressed. Martha reported having seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed during the night, which disappeared when she lit the lamp. She mentioned whispering voices that seemed to come from within the walls, speaking words that she could not understand but that somehow seemed directed at her. On January 2nd, 1867, she wrote, "I found that photograph again at the bottom of the dresser drawer, although I am certain I burned it 3 days ago. How is this possible? The image seems different now. His eyes seem to follow me around the room. Tomorrow I will burn it again, and this time I will scatter the ashes in the garden." The photograph in question was never found, and the ledger does not specify whose image it was. Considering that Martha refers to the person in the photograph as him in capital letters, Professor Blackburn initially assumed it was her late husband. However, later entries cast doubt on this interpretation. On January 5th, she writes, "I did not sleep again. The sounds in the walls continue, louder now, more insistent. They no longer seem like scratches, but rhythmic knocks, as if someone or something was trying to communicate through a code. I have made the decision to check the cellar tomorrow, the small door at the back which has remained locked all these years. Perhaps there is something there that explains these phenomena. The key is still with me, kept in the jewelry box since that day in 1859. Zachariah made me promise never to open it, but he is no longer here to protect me from whatever lies on the other side. And what if what torments me is precisely there?" On January 6th, the entry is brief and disturbing. "I went down to the cellar today. The key was no longer in the jewelry box, although I am certain I left it there last night. I found it in the lock of the small door, as if someone had placed it there. The door was ajar. The smell that came from inside, I cannot describe it adequately, a mixture of damp earth, mold, and something else, something metallic like old blood or oxidized iron. I did not have the courage to open the door completely or enter. I locked it again and brought the key with me. Tonight, I will sleep with it under my pillow." On January 15th, Martha reports a recurring dream, the same dream, for the 3rd night in a row. "I am standing before that door in the cellar, the one I always keep locked. In the dream, I know I should not open it, but my hands move against my will. When the door opens, I see only darkness and feel an intense cold coming from within. Then, from the depths of this darkness, I hear that voice, not Zachariah's, but the other one, the one who promised to return. I am fulfilling my promise, says the voice. And then I wake up, always at 3:17 in the morning, with the sensation that there is someone sitting on the edge of my bed. The reference to the other voice and the promise of return is particularly intriguing, as there is no previous mention in the ledger of such a promise or who might have made it. Professor Blackburn dedicated considerable time trying to discover if there might be some secret door or hidden room in the cellar of the house on Oak Ridge Road. But when he finally obtained permission to examine the property in May 1958, he discovered that the cellar had been completely cemented during a renovation carried out in 1916 when the house was briefly occupied by a family of merchants from Baltimore. This family, the Harringtons, remained on the property for only 7 months, a remarkably short period considering the substantial investment they had made in renovating the house. Winston Harrington, patriarch of the family, was a successful merchant who had built a prosperous importing business. In 1916, at the age of 52, he decided to acquire a residence that reflected his social status, and Martha Collins' old house, which had remained closed for years, presented itself as an opportunity. Records of the time show that Harrington hired architect Frederick Lawrence to supervise an extensive renovation of the property, including modernizations such as electrical installation and internal plumbing. A curious detail appears in the architect's notes, preserved in the Public Municipal Archive. Client insisted on complete cementing of the cellar after incident with the workers. I suggested keeping at least one section as a wine cellar, given the favorable climate, but Mr. Harrington was adamant. "I want that space permanently sealed," were his exact words. The incident mentioned is not detailed in the official notes, but Professor Blackburn obtained some information through an assistant of Frederick Lawrence, the architect who worked on the renovation. According to this assistant who accompanied the project, 2 workers who were removing debris from the cellar discovered a small door embedded in the back wall. Curious, they forced the lock and found a narrow compartment, no larger than a closet. What they saw inside was never fully clarified, but both men abandoned their service on the same day, refusing to return even when offered double pay. One of them, it is said, moved away from the town the following week. As the end of January approached, the entries in the ledger became more spaced out and fragmented. The handwriting began to show signs of deterioration, with words crossed out and stains that could be tears or spilled ink. On January 27th, there is a particularly disturbing entry. "I can no longer sleep. When I close my eyes, I feel his presence in the room. The walls are damp now, although it has not rained. The moisture forms patterns that look like faces watching. The smell, that same smell of wet earth and something else, something I recognize but cannot name. I should have burned all those objects when I had the chance. Now it is too late. Zechariah knew," he tried to warn me. An entry from January 29th contains an even more disturbing account. Someone, or something, has been walking through the house during the night. I hear the footsteps above my room, in the attic that has remained locked for years. The creaking of the floorboards is unmistakable. Last night I gathered courage to go up and check. The attic door was locked as always, the key kept in the drawer of my desk. But when I placed my ear against the wood, I clearly heard breathing on the other side, heavy and irregular. Even more disturbing was that as I moved away, the breathing stopped abruptly, as if whatever was in there knew I was listening. I returned to my room and locked the door. At dawn, I woke to the sound of scratching at my door. It was not like an animal trying to enter, but something deliberate. 3 slow scratches, followed by 3 faster ones. Then a pause, and the pattern repeated. I remained motionless in bed, without the courage to check. The scratching continued for nearly an hour, then ceased. In the morning, I examined the door. There were no visible marks on the wood. On January 31st, Martha makes a cryptic reference to a past event. I have thought much about that night, the last in which Zechariah seemed truly lucid before the illness consumed him completely. He called me to the study late at night and gave me the key to that door in the cellar, making me swear never to open it. "What we did was wrong, Martha," he said. "I should not have brought that into our house. I should not have made that agreement." I never knew what agreement he was referring to. Zachariah always dealt with his business privately, but I remember that in 1857, after returning from a trip to Philadelphia, he changed. He became more reserved, spent hours alone in the cellar, and occasionally I heard him conversing down there, although I never saw anyone enter or leave. It was after this trip that the compartment at the back of the cellar was built, officially to store important documents. Now I wonder, what is really kept in there? The last regular entry is dated February 9, 1867. I found marks on the cellar floor today, as if something heavy had been dragged toward that door. I did not enter there. I cannot. But I know I must face him eventually. The voices are louder now, almost clear enough to understand what they say. I think they are calling my name, or perhaps it is just the wind. Tomorrow I will go to the church to speak with Reverend Whitcomb. Perhaps he can help. Thus, there is no record that Martha Collins actually sought out Reverend Samuel Whitcomb. According to the parish visitation book, preserved in diocesan archives, her last confession took place on January 26, 1867. However, there exists an intriguing document in the Reverend's personal archives, a handwritten note on high-quality paper signed by Martha Collins and dated February 10, 1867. Reverend Whitcomb, I beg forgiveness for not attending our meeting scheduled for today. Unforeseen circumstances require my presence at home. The matter about which I intended to consult you has become more urgent than I imagined. I request your prayers, as I fear I am facing something that transcends my understanding and perhaps the very doctrine of the Church. If we do not see each other again in this world, know that I departed at peace with my conscience, though not necessarily at peace with what inhabits these walls. May God protect you, Martha Collins. Reverend Whitcomb never mentioned this note publicly, and it was only discovered after his death in 1905, among his personal documents. After the entry of February 9th, there is an interval of almost a month without annotations. Then, on March 10th, 4 days before her absence was first noticed, there's a final entry. The handwriting is almost unrecognizable, tremulous and hasty, as if written by someone on the verge of collapse. It is here, in the house, with me. It is not Zachariah. It never was. The door in the cellar is open now. I was not the one who opened it. The sounds it makes as it moves through the walls. I can no longer stay, but where to go when he is everywhere? The photographs, all of them, even those I burned, have returned. The faces in the photos have changed. They all have his eyes now. I need to end this. There is only one way. This is the last clearly legible entry in the ledger. In the final pages, there are only incoherent scribbles and what appear to be frustrated attempts to draw something, perhaps a face or a symbol. On the last page, there is a single phrase written with a surprisingly clear and firm handwriting, so different from the previous text that it raised questions about whether it had been written by the same person. I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning. Professor Harrison Blackburn spent the following years trying to construct a clearer chronology of the events and determine what really happened to Martha Collins. In his research notebooks, found after his death in 1966, he raises several hypotheses ranging from supernatural explanations, which he himself dismissed as the product of a lonely, elderly woman's fevered imagination, to more mundane possibilities. An intruder who tormented the widow, some distant relative with interest in her inheritance, or even a case of progressive mental deterioration culminating in flight or suicide. One of the aspects that most intrigued the professor was the coincidence between the recurring time in Martha's dreams, 3:17, and the fact that all the clocks in the house were found stopped at that same time. This coincidence suggested that something significant occurred at that specific moment, possibly on the night before her disappearance. Another disturbing element that Blackburn highlighted in his notes was the final phrase of the ledger. The handwriting of this last entry, so different from the rest, raised questions about its authenticity. Would it be possible that someone else had written that line? And if so, who? And what would be the meaning of that understanding mentioned? One of the most intriguing aspects that Blackburn discovered during his investigation were the death records of Zachariah Collins. According to the official document, he died of natural causes on January 12, 1859. However, when examining the archives of the old Harper's Mill Infirmary, the professor found a medical report that offered additional details. Collins had suffered from a mysterious ailment that caused severe hallucinations in the weeks prior to his death. The responsible physician, Dr. Montgomery Pierce, described that the patient frequently spoke about something that lived inside the walls and insisted that he had made an agreement that he could not fulfill. This medical report, dated January 10, 1859, includes additional observations that Blackburn considered particularly relevant. The patient alternates between periods of lucidity and episodes of extreme agitation. During moments of mental clarity, he expresses a rational and consistent fear related to an agreement he would have made during his trip to Philadelphia in 1857. Although reluctant to provide specific details, he mentioned having acquired an ancient object from a merchant in Philadelphia, an object that he now keeps stored in a special compartment in his residence. More concerning is his insistence that this object is not inanimate. Mr. Collins, a man of education and respectable social position, does not seem given to superstitions. However, he describes with disturbing conviction that the object changed after being brought to his house, and that now it communicates with him through the walls. When questioned about the nature of these communications, the patient becomes extremely agitated, refusing to elaborate. In the last 48 hours, his physical state has deteriorated significantly. He presents permanently dilated pupils, even under intense light, abnormally low body temperature, and a peculiar odor emanating from the skin that does not correspond to any pathological condition known to this physician. There are also inexplicable marks on the forearms and neck, similar to contusions, but with a regular pattern that suggests more a deliberate contact than accidental injuries. As a physician, I must record only observable facts, but I confess that this case defies my scientific understanding. If I were a man of lesser education, I might suggest that Mr. Collins is under some type of malevolent influence. As I am not, I limit myself to documenting his condition and administering the prescribed sedatives to alleviate his suffering, although I fear the outcome is inevitably fatal. Zachariah Collins died 2 days after the drafting of this report. The death certificate, signed by the same Dr. Montgomery Pierce, lists cardiac arrest as the cause of death, omitting all the disturbing details documented in the hospital report. During his research, Professor Blackburn also interviewed several old residents of the area, including Adelaide Stokes, who in 1867 was a young woman of 19 who lived 2 houses down from the Collins residence. According to Adelaide's testimony, recorded in 1958, in those days no one spoke openly about the old lady's house, but everyone knew there was something strange there. My mother forbade me to pass in front of that house alone. On full moon nights we sometimes heard sounds coming from there, not screams, not exactly voices, but a kind of low lament, like someone humming a sad melody. On the morning they discovered she had disappeared, I was returning from the bakery and saw something I never told the authorities. I saw a man leaving the house very early, before the sun had even risen. He wore a hat that covered his face and carried something in his arms, wrapped in a dark cloth. At the time, I thought it might be a doctor, perhaps, who had been called during the night. But now, thinking about it, why would a doctor leave carrying something like that instead of simply doing his work and leaving? This testimony raises disturbing questions about the events of that morning. Who would the man seen by Adelaide be? What was he carrying? And why did this information never reach the official authorities? In a note following the interview with Adelaide, Professor Blackburn writes, "The description of the man seen by A.S. curiously corresponds to reports of a stranger who was occasionally seen visiting Zachariah Collins in the months preceding his death. According to Millicent Davis, this visitor never identified himself, always arrived after nightfall, and Collins insisted on receiving him alone in the study or in the cellar. The housekeeper described him as a thin man, very pale, of considerable height, always dressed in dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. But coincidence? Or would it be possible that the same individual was somehow connected to both the death of Collins and the disappearance of his wife 8 years later? The house on Oak Ridge Road remained closed for many years after Martha Collins's disappearance. In 1916, it was acquired by Baltimore merchant Winston Harrington, who carried out extensive renovations before moving in with his family. Curiously, the Harringtons occupied the property for only 7 months before suddenly moving, selling the house for a value far below market. When questioned about the reasons for the move, Winston Harrington reportedly said only that the house was not suitable for a family with peace of mind. During the interview he gave to Professor Blackburn in 1958, Winston Harrington, then 94 years old and residing in Pittsburgh, showed extreme reluctance to discuss his brief occupation of the house on Oak Ridge Road. Only after much insistence did he agree to provide some details, with the express condition that the conversation not be recorded. According to Blackburn's notes, Harrington reported that in the first weeks after the move, the family was enthusiastic about the new residence. The renovation had been extensive, modernizing the house without compromising its historic character. However, after approximately 1 month, inexplicable events began to occur. At first they were small things, Harrington reportedly said, objects that disappeared and reappeared in different places. Strange sounds in the walls, like scratches or rhythmic knocks. My wife complained of a persistent odor in the main bedroom, a smell of damp earth and something metallic that no cleaning could eliminate. We replaced the floorboards, checked plumbing, even removed part of the wall covering, but the smell always returned. The incident that finally motivated the move, according to Harrington, occurred on a night in July 1916. His wife woke up screaming, claiming to have seen a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. When Harrington lit the lamp, there was no one there. However, on the dresser, they found an object that did not belong to them, a small carved wooden box containing a single photograph. It was a photograph of an elderly woman sitting in a chair, said Harrington. Behind her, there was something like a shadow, but with a vaguely human form. Most disturbing were the woman's eyes. They were completely black, like holes in the image. I immediately recognized her as the former owner, Martha Collins, whose portrait I had seen at the county clerk's office when we signed the purchase papers. On the back of the photograph was a phrase written, "Hubofte. He lives in the walls and wants company." The following morning, Harrington hired workers to completely cement the cellar, especially the hidden compartment that had been discovered during the renovation. A week later, the family left the house, never returning even to retrieve many of the personal belongings they left behind. In the years that followed, the property passed through several owners, none remaining for more than 2 years. In 1942, after remaining empty for almost a decade, it was finally demolished to make way for a small commercial building, which initially housed a pharmacy and later a fabric store. During the demolition, as reported in the Harper's Mill Gazette of July 17, 1942, the workers made a macabre discovery. As they removed the cemented floor of the cellar, they found a small wooden door sealed with what appeared to be black wax. The foreman, Joshua Campbell, decided to open the door, revealing a small compartment no larger than a closet. Inside, there were only 3 items, an old matchbox, a broken perfume bottle, and a faded photograph. The report does not offer details about the content of the photograph, mentioning only that it was handed over to the authorities. However, there is no record of this photograph in police archives of the time. The only indication of its possible content comes from an interview given by Joshua Campbell himself to Professor Blackburn in 1958. I will never forget that image as long as I live. It was a photograph of an elderly woman, probably the famous Martha Collins, seated in a chair. Behind her there was an obscure figure, like a shadow with human form. Most disturbing were the lady's eyes in the photo. They were completely black, as if someone had covered them with ink. And there was a message written on the back of the photograph. But it was so faded that I could only make out a few words: fulfilled, promise, inside, walls. Campbell also revealed a detail that he omitted from the press at the time. Beside the photograph, they found what appeared to be a small box of carved bone, similar to an ancient reliquary. The box was empty, except for a thin layer of dark dust at the bottom. When asked what happened to this object, Campbell confessed to having been disturbed by the discovery and decided to burn it that very night, along with the matchbox. The photograph, being potentially relevant to the old disappearance case, was the only thing he handed over to the authorities. Professor Harrison Blackburn died in September 1966, before concluding his research on the case of Martha Collins. His notes and collected materials were donated to the university library. But inexplicably, much of this collection disappeared during a reorganization of the archive in 1968, leaving only a few field notebooks and correspondences. The inexplicable loss of these documents, ironically similar to the disappearance of Martha Collins's original ledger from police records, was attributed to an administrative error by the library management. However, Amelia Webster, the professor's assistant who helped him catalog the material before the donation, expressed doubts about this explanation. We meticulously organized the entire collection related to the case. There were more than 12 notebooks of annotations, photographs of the house before demolition, copies of official documents, transcriptions of interviews, everything cataloged in 3 file boxes with clear labels. The professor was extremely methodical. It is simply impossible that all this material was lost through a common bureaucratic error. In one of the remaining notebooks, dated August 1959, Blackburn records a disturbing personal experience. After months investigating the case, he began to suffer from insomnia and to hear strange sounds in his own home, scratches in the walls, footsteps in the corridor when he was alone, the creaking of a rocking chair in his study, although he did not own such furniture. In his last known note about the case, he writes, "I dreamt of her last night. Martha Collins was standing in the cellar of the house on Oak Ridge Road before that door. She looked directly at me and said, 'You too made a promise, Professor.' And when I woke, I found a matchbox identical to the one described in the demolition report on my desk. I don't know how it got there. My house was locked. Tomorrow I will end this research. There are questions that should not be answered, mysteries that should remain buried. Martha Collins understood this too late. I still have time." Professor Blackburn formally abandoned his research on the case of Martha Collins soon after this incident, returning to his previous studies on the social history of West Virginia. He rarely mentioned the subject, and when questioned, said only that he had lost interest in the story. A curious detail, documented by his assistant Amelia, is that the professor insisted on burning all his notebooks related to the case that were still in his personal possession. The assistant also reported a change in his behavior after abandoning the research. He began to avoid working after nightfall, installed additional lighting in his home, and developed an almost phobic aversion to enclosed spaces such as cellars and attics. The truth about what happened to Martha Collins in February 1867 remains a mystery. Her body was never found. No concrete evidence of crime was established. Official records continue to list her case as a disappearance. In 1960, a journalist from the Harper's Mill Gazette named Wallace Kent attempted to reopen the investigation, fascinated by the urban legend that had formed around the widow's house, as it was locally known. He managed to locate and interview Millicent Davis, the Reverend's housekeeper, who had found the empty house in 1867. Millicent, then 83 years old, showed signs of senile dementia, but in moments of lucidity told Kent something she had never officially mentioned. When I entered that house, I immediately felt that something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the absence of the lady. It was as if the house were breathing. The walls seemed to pulse subtly, like a heart beating very slowly, and there was a smell. Not of decomposition or disease, but of freshly dug earth and candle wax. The strangest thing was what I found in her room. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it. On the pillow there was a single object, an old key, large, probably to the cellar, and beside the key, almost imperceptible against the white of the sheet, small stains of a dark liquid that I preferred to believe was ink. Millicent also revealed to the journalist a detail she had omitted from the police in 1867 out of fear of being considered superstitious or mentally unstable. When I went down to the cellar to check if Martha Collins might be there, I noticed that the small door at the back, the one she always kept locked, was ajar. The strong smell of damp earth came from there. I approached with trepidation, but something urged me to look. The compartment beyond the door was small, like a closet built into the wall, but it seemed to extend deeper than the structure of the house would allow. The inner walls were of compacted earth, not masonry like the rest of the cellar. In the center, there was an object that I could not immediately identify. It seemed like a small carved box, made of some material that was neither wood nor metal. Next to it, a photograph turned face down. I touched nothing. Something about that place caused me an instinctive dread, something I cannot explain. I closed the door, ran up the stairs, and never returned to that house. Wallace Kent's article about the case was published in a Sunday edition of the Harper's Mill Gazette in July 1960, but did not generate the interest he expected. The story had become just another urban legend among so many others that populated the town's imagination. Kent himself soon moved on to other subjects, and the mystery of Martha Collins was again relegated to oblivion. A disturbing coincidence, not publicly recorded, was the sudden death of Wallace Kent just 3 months after the publication of his article. According to the death certificate, he died in his sleep, victim of a heart attack, at the age of 42. A colleague from the newsroom, however, confided to Professor Blackburn that in the weeks prior to his death, Kent had become increasingly paranoid, claiming to hear strange sounds in his apartment and feeling constantly watched. He also mentioned having found, without explanation, an old matchbox on his desk, similar to the one described in the demolition report of the house. Today, the site where the Collins house once stood houses a small department store. The oldest employees sometimes comment on strange nocturnal occurrences, merchandise that changes places, sounds of footsteps on the upper floor when the establishment is empty, and occasionally the persistent aroma of old perfume that seems to emanate from the walls. The current manager, Dorothy Jenkins, who has worked at the location since 1956, reports that these occurrences intensify at certain times of the year, particularly in February, the month of Martha Collins's disappearance. It's something that everyone who works here for some time ends up noticing. It's not frightening, it's more uncomfortable, as if you're never really alone in the building, even when you clearly are. Some employees refuse to close the store alone, especially on Mondays. I don't know why specifically on Mondays, but that's when the strange things seem to happen more frequently. The air becomes heavier, like before a storm, and that old perfume smell appears, a sweet aroma, but with an underlying note of damp earth. And sometimes, just for an instant, You have the sensation of seeing someone out of the corner of your eye, usually near the staircase that once led to the cellar. When you turn around, there's no one there. Recently, in 1965, during a renovation of the store's floor, workers found, embedded in the concrete, a small silver medallion with the inscription MC 1867. The object was donated to the town's historical museum, where it remains on display, a silent reminder that some secrets resist the passage of time. Curiously, the museum employee responsible for cataloging the piece, Montgomery Davis, reported a strange incident related to the medallion. According to him, on the first night after the item was placed on exhibition, the museum's security cameras recorded an inexplicable failure precisely at 3:17 in the morning, lasting exactly 7 minutes. When the system resumed functioning, the medallion had moved inside the display case, rotating 180 degrees. Technicians examined the system and found no explanation for the failure. What really happened to Martha Collins in that house on Oak Ridge Road? Was she the victim of a common crime committed by someone interested in her fortune? Did she succumb to madness and isolation, fleeing or taking her own life? Or is there something darker in the story, something that official records and rational explanations cannot completely capture? Perhaps the answer lies in the last legible words of her ledger. I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning. What would this late understanding be, and who, or what, was he? Professor Blackburn, in his final notes on the case, offers an intriguing perspective. After months of investigation, I find myself contemplating possibilities that my academic training hesitates to accept. The patterns are undeniable: the black eyes in the photographs, the persistent smell of damp earth and metal, the sounds in the walls, the specific time, 3:17, that appears repeatedly. The sensation of being watched. The progressive mental deterioration of people who delve into the mystery. And, most disturbing, the obscure figure described consistently by witnesses separated by decades. There is an element in this case that resists conventional explanations, something that seems to persist beyond the demolition of the house, beyond the death of the original witnesses, beyond even time itself. Like an echo that refuses to dissipate, or a presence that has found a way to transcend the physical limits that should contain it. I dare not fully articulate what I suspect. But the last phrase in Martha Collins' ledger, "I finally understood what he wanted from the beginning," continues to resonate. What did she understand? And why did this understanding coincide with her disappearance? There exists an old concept in Appalachian folklore, rarely discussed openly, called a soul buyer, a being who is not exactly human, who makes agreements, grants wishes, but eventually returns to collect a payment much more valuable than the beneficiary initially perceives. Would it be possible that Zachariah Collins, during his mysterious trip to Philadelphia, encountered something of this nature? Something that he brought home, confining it in that sealed compartment in the cellar, only to discover too late that some entities cannot be truly contained? Pure speculation, naturally. The most probable explanation remains a conventional crime or a tragic case of mental instability. However, I cannot ignore the chill I feel when rereading the accounts, nor the persistent sensation that, in investigating this mystery, I have attracted some kind of unwanted attention. Some stories have no definitive conclusion, only echoes that resonate through the decades, reminding us that not all mysteries were meant to be unraveled. The case of Martha Collins is one of those echoes, a whisper from the past that, even after more than a century, still makes us look with suspicion at old walls and dark cellars, wondering what might be hidden beyond appearances. And if, by chance, you find yourself walking through the historic streets of Harper's Mill at dusk and feel a sudden chill as if being watched, if you perceive a vague aroma of old perfume in the air, perhaps it is merely coincidence, or perhaps it is a reminder that Some presences never truly leave. Some promises once made are impossible to break. There is an old saying in West Virginia, "Not all stories end when the person dies." In the case of Martha Collins, it seems the story only began with her disappearance, and perhaps, in some sense we do not completely understand, it still continues to this day. And you who now know this story, have you checked the walls of your house today? Have you paid attention to the sounds that come from them when everything is silent? And if by chance you wake up at 3:17 in the morning, perhaps it would be prudent to avoid looking at the dark corners of the room. Some things, once seen, cannot be forgotten. Some stories, once known, become part of us. As the old folks used to say, knowledge is power, but some knowledge is also a burden, and some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again.